There's so much academic work on Cholas. Probably one of the most well-worked time periods in Tamil history, and probably one of the biggest Tamil heroes come from the Chola period. So, how did you get interested in it? And how did you, if I may say so, dare to write this book? Because some of the best historical minds have turned their attention to the Cholas, whether it is Neelaganda Shastri or it is the greatest living Chola historian, Subbarayalu, or historians from outside India like Pertenstein and more recently with Nichols. So you have this huge number of academic historians who obviously have done a very thorough job. So first tell me why you set out to write this book. Set out to write this story.
Thank you so much, and thank you all once again. Monday morning, as Chalapathy sir said, not only have you listened to a long lecture, you are now going to listen to a long conversation. I'd like to actually begin by answering the second question first, which is that it's pretty much the foolishness of youth. When I set out to write this book, I had no idea what I had really gotten myself in for. But increasingly, as I began to read the work of all these extraordinary scholars, it began to dawn on me just how impactful the Cholas were, not just on the history of South India at large, especially in my home state of Andhra Pradesh, as well as my adopted state of Karnataka, but really in the history of the Indian Ocean and the world at large. If you were to look at the world in the early 11th century, you have a situation generally of political fragmentation, and kings were not able to really mobilize large amounts of resources. And then this gleaming beacon here in South India, this titanic Brihadishwara temple, is being imagined from pretty much the last place I would expect to have an empire rising, because there is such a proud tradition in Tamil Nadu of regional or local rule by assemblies. But very often it's from these very unlikely places that extraordinary new political strategies and ideas develop that end up changing the history of the world. And the Cholas did this in such myriad ways that, as Chalapathy sir said, it has sparked off decades upon decades of extremely specialized academic studies. So you will find tomes that look at simply at Chola architecture of a few decades. You will look at, there are studies that have been done of just the representation of women in Chola sources over the centuries. There have been theses written about individual court poets of the Cholas. That is the amount of material that we have from this dynasty that revealed to us this extremely rich and complex world. But to William's point about the public historian versus the academic, so many of these extraordinary discoveries have remained within the fortress of academia. It has required extraordinary amounts of training and knowledge just to be able to read the works of these scholars and to understand the discoveries that they are making. And I think that we are at a time and a place in the history of India where curiosity about the past must be satisfied. Either it can be satisfied by simplistic misinformation, or it will be satisfied by historians who rise to meet the challenge. And this foolishness of youth that I alluded to earlier was in a sense buttressed by the fact that I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. We have one of these giants, David Chalman, sitting in the front row here. And to know that the work is out there, the scholarly sophistication, the discoveries are out there, and that I needed to rise to the challenge of understanding, assimilating, examining all this material, and then weave it into a narrative that explores everything the dynasty did. So instead of doing purely a political history, which is where the discipline arguably began, meaning the Kanta Shastri, or instead of doing a detailed philological study like what Whitney Cox has been doing at the University of Chicago, I wanted to have a book that examines this entire mosaic of sources and reveals this dynasty and the extraordinary impact they had in South India. And I wanted to do it in a way that is narratively engaging, that brings brings to life these medieval people who were as human as you and I, who had the same foibles, the same ambitions, the same capacity, I think, for extraordinary creativity, but also the darker sides of human nature. I think that this understanding of historical figures, this understanding of them as people, this ability to read the evidence they left behind as evidence made by humans like you and I, is not as widespread as it needs to be in Indian popular culture. And I see my work as contributing to that grander project.
I'm glad that you actually mentioned the huge presence of Chola heroes and Chola history in popular memory. But there is also a paradox, right? Barely 100 years ago, very few actually knew about the Cholas. When Vausi launched the shipping company and he talked about the glories of ancient India, he had no knowledge about the Cholas' naval exploits. So everything begins only from the 1920s, and it is now nearly a century since Neelakanta Shastri wrote his magnum opus. But it was taken to the next level by Kalki's novel. And now, since it has become a pan-Indian movie, the name at least has become very familiar. And I also want to draw attention to another novel, multi-part novel, which I think might probably even overtake the popularity of Kalki. Balakumaran's Udayar has the makings of that kind of reach. So we find this paradox. 100 years ago, we barely knew anything about the Cholas. Most of the temples were overgrown. Archaeologists went about, cleaning them up and gathering the records. And suddenly, in a period of about 2 generations, they reach the kind of pinnacle of glory, and it has further ramifications in the sense of, for instance, very clearly LTT model, drew motifs from Chola history, and the tiger symbol itself comes from the Cholas. So, in this change, this particular change has not actually been reflected in, as you say, writings about the Cholas in English. So, how did you go about doing this? Because there's 2 parts to it. You have already mentioned the vast amount of academic literature on it, and also the other something that is very unusual for most time periods in Indian history: the sources. Indian historians often complain about the lack of sources, but in the case of the Cholas, there is this huge volume of inscriptional epigraphical material. So, can you tell us about how you went about looking at this evidence? Because you have not relied purely on secondary literature. Yes, it's a very thorough bibliography. You have covered all the major academic historians writing about Cholas, but also you have used a huge amount of the primary material themselves. So can you tell us how you went about doing it and how you tried to match the existing academic wisdom on the subject and your own reading of the text in translation and otherwise?
What a great question, sir. So, for me, the main way to understand the Cholas is to look at the expanding regional footprint. There is a fantastic resource for scholars, T.V. Mahalingam's topographical list of inscriptions. So, Professor Mahalingam, under the Indian Council for Historical Research, went to every district in Tamil Nadu and Kerala. He went to every temple and he put down a list year by year of all the inscriptions that were made by whom. Then there is the concordance of names in Chola inscriptions, which was written by Professor Subrayanu and Professor Karashima. And what they did is look at the names and where all they are appearing. and they provide this extensive index. Now, what this allows us to do is something that you can't do for any other place in medieval India. To give you a bit more context, when a temple is built in North India or a temple is built in the Deccan, there is a foundation inscription that is made. So there is a stone that is raised that has a carving of who made this temple, what gifts were given to it, and this nice little depiction of Shiva or Regina, whoever. And the other records of the temple, century after century, were kept in palm leaf. So they just disappear after a few decades. But in Tamil Nadu, every record pertaining to a temple is kept mostly on the temple walls. It's written onto the walls of the temple. So this gives us essentially a living archive. And really, in many temples, even today, when you'll see there's a huge list of donors for such and such Archana Seva, like how much was given, and there's like a list that is provided. Now, it's a continuation, that same tradition that's over 1,000 years old. Now, what this allows us to do is, you can say that, okay, this member of the Chola court was in this temple in this year. Now, the concern for the earliest historians, such as Nilakanta Shastri, who are looking at this is, let us make a chronology, let's figure out which king is doing what. Because sometimes you have kings who use like 2 or 3 titles. So the primary emphasis is on what the kings are doing. But what I really enjoy doing is looking at, fine, the kings are doing this, but what is everybody else doing? And you will see essentially that there's this footprint of a changing society that is left on the temple walls. Partially through the epigraphy, because who is making the gifts, how rich are the gifts, where are the gifts being sourced from. So when camphor is showing up in a temple inscription, you know that they have established a connection to some global trade route, for example. But also in the architecture of the temple, who is building what, when, what is the purpose of this architecture. You can figure out a lot about what a space is for simply by how it's arranged. Very obviously, like if somebody 200 years later were to come into this hall where we're all sitting, they would figure out that this is a space where people could be seen by everybody else who's sitting there. Simple enough, right? Now if you look at the earliest temples that are built in the 10th century, they're very small. The innermost wall is always really tiny, and the mandapa is not meant to hold a large crowd of people. The garbhagriha can maybe hold like 2 or 3 folks. But by the 12th and 13th centuries, you see huge 1,000-pillar mandapas. The prakaras become the size of like 2 or 3 football fields put together. What does that suggest? They're meant to accommodate crowds. The earlier temples, whether for reasons of pilgrimage, whether for reasons of space, of politics, weren't designed for large numbers of people, but the later temples were. So obviously there is some grand social change that is in the making, and you can tell that just from the architecture. Then when you look at the inscriptions, you can get a much more granular look at what is happening. So this was one major pillar of my approach. It was to read the architectural, art historical evidence in conjunction with the literature, and to keep an eye for bigger social trends. The other aspect of the approach was to read the royal inscriptions more closely. Now, a lasting problem for medieval studies in India has been that you can't tell much about the lives of ordinary people, because the king is not going to be sitting and saying, oh, my subjects are living like this. The king is going to say, the great goddess of the earth has become my consort. But when you look at what exactly the king is saying where, and you start to think, okay, why is he saying this here? What language is he writing in? Who are the people who could read this language? Then you start to figure out a little bit about the audiences, right? So I came across this really interesting set of inscriptions made by the sons of Rajendra Chola in Manimangalam, which is an agraharam not far from Kanchipuram. And their inscriptions are in this classicized Tamil that focuses on the great military conquests, and very often these messages are brought to the Brahmin assembly at Manimangalam by a Brahmin general who owns land in the agraharam and is a member of the Chola court. Now in contrast, if you look at the inscriptions made in agraharams in the Kaveri valley, they're made in Sanskrit. And the Brahmins there are not just Tamils, there are also a lot of Telugus who are coming from Nellore. So the language that he used to speak to them is different, and the political claims that are being made are not just about, oh, I went and conquered this, I went and conquered that. There will be claims like, I am the descendant of the sun, I defeated the enemy just as the heroes of the Mahabharata did. So there's a different register, a different kind of audience that is being performed for not just the locals, but really you can imagine these Sanskrit copper plates were copied out into documents and then circulated to other courts as well. So you can see this eerily modern sensibility of political power to wear many hats and many masks depending on who it's speaking to. Now this method has been developed by Whitney Cox for his biography of Kulathunga Chola, and I think there is tremendous value in reading the activities of other Chola kings in this light as well, because it allows us to have a much better sense of who they were as people. Beyond the cultural idea of them as heroes, you begin to really understand them as individuals who have dreams, ambitions, who have worries, concerns, and who are trying to assuage that in some way through the images that they are projecting out into their world.
Anirudh, apart from the academic literature and the sources, you seem to have travelled a lot, travelled extensively, have taken pictures. Can you tell us something about your travels? What is it, what kind of understanding that you gained from the travels as such by looking at these artifacts? You also talk about, for instance, the topography of the floodplains. It crops up repeatedly in your story. So, can you tell us about your travels?
Sure. So, in January last year, thanks to a generous grant by the MAP Academy, which is the educational wing of the Museum of Art and Photography in Bangalore, I was able to travel to about 30 sites, not just in South Karnataka, but also through various parts of the floodplain. The way that I managed to do this was that I would wear a munda with a belt inside to make sure it didn't fall off. And I would petition the temple administration to allow me to photograph the sculptures, in some cases even to record the bronzes, only for my personal study, not for broader publication. And because I was accompanied by a couple of very, very well-dressed and gentle friends of mine from Bangalore, who are a few decades older than me, we managed to get away with it in most cases. But what repeatedly struck me was how much of the urban form of the Kaveri area is directly a result of the Chola polity. Almost every major urban center in the Kaveri area is centered around a Chola temple. But interestingly enough, while the innermost prakaras or the main vimana might be constructed by a Chola royal, either a queen or a king, usually the really impressive structures, the gopurams, the bigger prakaras, the really large shrines which are depicted like a chariot with giant wheels and so on, these are usually made by Chola generals. And they're made in the 12th century after the high tide of Chola military expansion. So what is happening in the 12th century is that as the central power is beginning to fade, financial acumen, concepts like private property are being developed by a wide swathe of the elite of the Kaveri floodplain. And commanding these enormous resources unleashed by military changes, they are able to transform the public spaces within which they are seen by locals. So a temple very quickly starts becoming purely a religious space, and you will see very strange things like landlords saying that, oh, this is my territory, that is your territory, and anybody who violates it, even if he has a beard, will grow breasts. So very clear, this very different class of people has managed to arrive into the temples and has very different ideas of what the temple should be used for than the earlier elite of the kingdom. But also more generally, I think that traveling this extensively helped me understand the Cholas in a regional context. Because I had a lot of fieldwork in South Karnataka, where I went to Kolar and also Talakad and Manne, which used to be the capital of the Lanka dynasty, and all that remains of it is like one temple in an industrial area north of Bangalore now. But what you can very clearly see is that the 9th and 10th century temples that are being built locally have a very different architectural program. Now, the unique feature of the Karnataka Dravida architectural tradition is that the wall is very rhythmic. It will keep going in and out, in and out. And it's used only for sculptures, it's not used for inscriptions. But once the Cholas arrive in the region, that disappears. You have these beautiful, long running flat walls punctuated by pilasters, and in between are extensive inscriptions in Tamil. So clearly, a new cultural layer has been added by the arrival of Chola power, and then subsequently by the arrival of merchants and warriors. Because you see, even in the Talakkad region, most of the temples, the Tamil style temples, are not built by kings, they are built by merchants. So you're able to trace out in the changing shape of the building how new elements of society are arriving and how they are using stone architecture to express different ideas of what the sacred space is for.
There are some questions that will come back to a little later. How much Chola history has had an impact on contemporary Tamil society, contemporary Tamil polity. But to get back to the core of the book itself, yes, there's one, perhaps it could be both the easy part and the difficult part. Getting the narrative about the successive kings. That work has been done extensively by early historians. But I suppose the challenge is to represent it now in a readable and interesting fashion. I think you have largely succeeded in that. So that is something that I'm sure the readers will be able to pick up quickly. But what I found very interesting was your frequent forays into everyday life, into quotidian details. Can you tell us how you went about looking at and asking these questions? What did people eat? How did they look? How did they get angry? What was the relationship between brothers? A whole range of things which certainly interest me a lot.
So Dr. Chalapathy is referring to this astonishing incident that we know about. I think it happened around 1054, if I recall correctly, where two impoverished peasants were arguing. So they were brothers, and the elder brother started the fight, and the younger brother, in a fit of rage, hit the elder brother so hard that he fell and died on the spot. And the reason we know this is because the family could not get justice locally. There were no judicial officers, no village assembly that would take care of this. They went all the way to Tamaraipakam, once again near Kanchipuram, and they went to a different kind of assembly called the Periyanadu. Now, the Nadu assembly is an assembly of local villages. The Periyanadu was claiming to speak for the entire region, dozens and dozens and dozens of villages. There have been no organization like this in the 10th century or in the early 11th century. Why did such an organization exist? If you look at the names of the members, we begin to get some answers. They're all important landowners who come from either the Vellala or the Brahmin caste. And what they do, the way they arrive onto the historical scene is by providing justice to a peasant who has come to them from far away. And then a few years later, there was a very interesting thing where somehow, having built local support and local legitimacy through such acts, they declare that we are setting the rate of tax on all the lands and we will decide how much we give to the king. So this suggests to me that there's this very vibrant tradition of local rule through assemblies that continues to grow, that in times of political crisis goes stronger, then disappears and then comes back again, depending on what the relationship of the center to the periphery is. But in the process, because instead of now seeing a king who is making various claims about his conquests, you have a different set of people who are interested in doing a different thing for a different audience. So once you begin to look for these kinds of stories, once you begin to read between the lines and ask yourself the question of who the audiences were, you can get some more hints of daily life, because why were these peasants in such a impoverished situation in the first place. We have this amazing description of the judicial process where the father has come to ask for justice for his murdered son against his other surviving son. And the assembly asks him, do you have any property? He says no. Do you have any other children? He says no. Then they say, okay, since you're elderly and you have no property, the only way you can survive is if your son provides for you. So make him give this gift to the temple and we will consider his sin to be expiated. Now what this reveals is that there's an impoverished family. And you can imagine that the reason why the brothers had such a contentious relationship was because they were constantly having to work and had very little emotional space for anything else. So of course in such a situation you will have confrontation. And more broadly, when you look at the 12th and 13th centuries, you have this astonishing situation where while the elites are getting more and more creative and like adding new aspects of temples and making them wider, you have agrarian crisis where cultivators are asking the landowners to reduce the taxes on that land. Once again, this allows us to make some guesses. Who are the cultivators? Which communities are they coming from? What is the kind of request that is being made? Very rarely do you find individual cultivators making these requests. You always find them working in collectives. So once again you get an insight into the way that these village lives function. Now that's the epigraphic aspect of it. The other aspect of it is art history. You have depictions of people in the fields. We know what the plows look like. We know what the bullocks look like. We have descriptions in Nataraja Chola's inscriptions of the type of sheep that were gifted. So they had red colored sheep, they had speckled sheep. We know what kind of pearls were being used. Of course, that has nothing to do with daily life. I don't think most people ever had a chance to see a pearl even. But they give you a sense of a world that is very colorful and quite extraordinarily to me. I think when we think of ancient and medieval India, we think of cows as the most important animal. But it seems that to medieval Tamils, it was sheep that was most important. So it was the smell of sheep, the sound of sheep that would have been most familiar to them. It was sheep ghee that was being burnt in the temple lamps. So putting all these details together and then asking the question of how would these details have been experienced, how they have been sensed by the people of those times, you can come up with a pretty good picture of how ordinary lives were, better than what you can do for most of medieval India.
Yes, I found that interesting, but I was somewhat uncomfortable when you speculate about moods, about the description of people, how they would have looked like. As a professional historian, I wouldn't do it.
Yeah.
But without this kind of speculation, you cannot actually write anything history. So how did you, what did you draw some lines for yourself? How did you say that, how far would you go based on the limited evidence that is there to comment about the facial hair or the demeanor of people?
So as far as facial hair is concerned, I only speculated on that when I had sculptures or murals to go off of. So we have a mural from the Bridishwara temple where Raja Chola is depicted. He's got a great bun of hair. He's got very impressive facial hair. And he's got very dark eyes. Now, did he actually look like that in person? Or is that how he may have looked when he was younger and that's how he wanted the sculptor to depict him? To what extent was a sculptor using artistic convention versus doing a realistic portrayal? These are questions that are impossible to answer. But it is still possible to suggest a picture to the reader. For the later kings like Rajadiraja and Rajendra II, the sons of Rajendra Chola, we have no depictions of them, no murals surviving that show us who they look like. So I made no mention of how they looked. I think the only other individual for whom I had a description was Veera Narasimha, the Hoysala king, and we have a beautiful portrait of him at the Chennakeshwara temple in Belur, which I've included in the insert as well. So when we have an actual depiction from the time, then I suggest the appearance. Otherwise, I focus on jewelry. We have plenty of descriptions of Chola jewelry. We have examples of it from bronzes. We know they had these spectacular makara shaped earrings, for example. They had these cartouches that were pinned to their hair with depictions of flowers, and they wore like piles of flour tied into their braids, that kind of thing. I can't tell you what their faces look like, but I can tell you what they were wearing. And that alone gives you a sense of the connoisseurship that the medieval royals tried to cultivate. Now the mood, of course, is a completely different matter. There I've tried to be as tentative as possible when suggesting what the moods of these people were, but I do think that generally speaking, we are a little too conservative and not at all speculating about the moods of medieval people, because there's a new trend in Western scholarship, especially when it comes to the history of medieval France, where scholars have argued that when a medieval royal is saying that I am making this gift for the merit of my mother, so that my mother's soul may rest in peace, why do we assume there was no emotion attached to it? Why do we assume it was purely a formulaic gesture? These, after all, are human beings. They are capable of feeling the same emotions as we. And while, of course, royals and politicians want to present themselves in particular ways, they do have emotions as well. So, I think a really good example of this is Velankumaran, the general of the Chola prince Rajaditya, and this prince is killed on the battlefield in 949 when the Rashtrakuta Empire invades the Chola kingdom. And Kumaran disappears from the inscriptional record after the battle and then shows up 10 years later. But now he is using the name of Chaturarana Pandita, and he belongs to a Shaivite order called the Mahavratins, who are related to the Kapalikas, so they do all these strange rituals with skulls and the remains of corpses. And in this inscription, which was made in the suburbs of present-day Chennai, in fact, he says that, I used to be this general, but I was ashamed because I could not achieve the bliss of Sahamarana Sukham, the dying alongside my lord. And so I wandered to the Ganga and I came back, and now I am Chaturarana Pandita and I am making this gift for the temple of Shiva. Does this seem like the actions of a man whose emotions cannot be read or speculated upon? I think we can guess that, because he's not dating this inscription in a Chola regnal year, he's dating it in the regnal year of the Rashtrakutas. So the Chola court does not summon the same loyalties that it once did for him. At the same time, he wants it to be known that I used to be this general, but now I'm an ascetic. And it seems that in a sense he is, whether or not he is actually coming to terms with his past, he wants it to be seen that I have in some way laid my past to rest. Would a man like this have done this if he did not have strong feelings for the prince who had died? So I think in cases like this we can suggest, we can't be completely sure, so I try to be as tentative as possible. But I think there should be more space to talk about and speculate about medieval people's emotions, not just in narrative histories like my own, but I do think that this could potentially be a body for further academic study, to understand family affiliations, family connections. Of course, Whitney Cox has already made some early moves in the space of male intimacy, but I think that there is much more that can be done.
Anirudh, all through the book there is a very strong current of arguing against anachronistic readings of the past. You take pot shots at people who try to feed nationalistic sentiments using past fragmentary evidence. So I was really surprised that you don't talk about Uttarameru at all. If you ask anybody or any person on the street, the moment you mention Chola, 3 or 4 words will come to their mind. One of them would be Uttarameru. Why does Uttarameru doesn't figure? And on the same line, I would also say, David, have you read the book?
Not yet.
Yeah, I must warn you that Kamban doesn't figure in this book at all. But don't judge me by the absence of Kamban. So, these 2 big absences, I am really, really curious why you haven't mentioned Uttarameru. And in a book where you talk so well about Kalingathu Bharani, about in a context where when everybody is celebrating war, you almost see as though this is Vyang Hundar is actually providing a critique of these kind of ghoulish, bloodthirsty, wars. So, why are these two big absences? Can you tell us? This is obviously a conscious decision. This is not by oversight.
So
why did you not include these two?
This is why I want to be in conversation with Chalapathy, because I knew I would get these very interesting questions. So, on the question of Uttara Meru, just to give all of you context, Uttara Meru is a Brahmin assembly which is on the way from the Kaveri area up to Kanchipuram. And Uttara Meru, we have a remarkable set of inscriptions that provide a detailed study of how a medieval Brahmin assembly conducted its affairs. And these include things like, if one member of a family is on this committee, then they can't be on any other committees. What exactly is a voting procedure? What qualifies somebody to vote? What qualifies somebody to be in this committee or that committee? It's a really extraordinary example of how medieval Tamil society thought about this collective rule. Now, I had to fit this into a chapter on Parantaka Chola, where a lot of different things are happening. Where the queens are, I had to explain queenly temple patronage, I had to connect the Cholas to the broader trends in subcontinental politics, I had to explain the basics of architecture, I had to use diagrams, I had to give some kind of insight into the emotional state of Rajaditya Chola's court and Velan Kumaran for narrative reasons, because he plays this like very emotionally cathartic role in the structure of the chapter. And I could not figure out for the life of me where to fit in Uttara Meru. And I tried to, when I'm looking at how to construct a narrative, I try to figure out what tangent, what deep dive is going to contribute what to the narrative and where can I potentially place it. Now Uttara Meru, given that it is an insight into the way that corporate assemblies function, I figured there are many other places where corporate assemblies do show up. We have, for example, the Perinada example I talked about, where the peasants are given justice. So, since the underlying concept is the same, and because a wealth of detail on the functioning of the assembly would be overwhelming to a reader in already a very dense book that goes into a lot of deep dives, and since it was already very well known, I thought that is where to talk about on stages like this, rather than introduce it to the book and risk disrupting the narrative for first time readers. And the same also applies for Kamban, because yes, and perhaps the greatest medieval Tamil poet, as you said, but chapter 5, my editor was already losing interest. He was like, Anirudh, there's already too much stuff here. I had this like whole section on what happened in Sri Lanka after the Cholas leave and so on. He's like, you have to cut, because you will lose people otherwise. And to me, the 5th chapter, which is set in the 12th century, it's when the Chola state is beginning to gradually decentralize and these powerful new regional leaders are emerging. New trends are happening in temple construction, as I mentioned, new social trends are happening. I could not find a way to have 4 great poets in the same chapter without overwhelming all the other stuff that readers had to understand. And once again, you will notice the one thing that Uttara Meru and Kamban both have in common is that they are very well known, and therefore I am hoping that the readers will forgive not, I would say, not their absence in this book, but the presence of many other things in their stead.
Thank you very much for that. I'm not fully convinced because I am on the opposite camp of your editor. Usually readers, as a reader I would say that the book had been shorter by about 50 pages, should have been better. But in this case, actually I would say especially the last chapter, I think the book has been telescoped a bit. 50-60 more pages would still have gone well with the reader. This is my understanding. But let us hope. I am sure you are going to write more books. We'd like to know what is going to be the next book. I have many more things to ask, but I think this time I let a Monday morning audience have their say.
Yes, please.
Questions only, no comments. Can we keep it to questions only and not comments? Thank you.
Anirudh, I loved your book, and I must thank you for the Pharaoh on Vatapi Ganapati's story. That was very nice. I was very curious as to how the lion of the kings, landed up buried in the middle of nowhere with no ceremony, no, great structure or anything, and no one brought his body back. What is your take on that?
Sorry, I'm not sure I understood the question. Talking about how the line of kings came to be buried?
Yeah, apparently.
The Chalukya kings?
No, the Raja Chola.
Yeah.
They say that he's buried in, a very nondescript place.
Yes, yes.
How
yes,
do you
yes.
think that has happened?
Well, I'm not 100% certain that is where he's buried, because we don't really have any inscriptions that talk about his passing, and what kind of funerary arrangements were made for him. And I think that once, at least in my understanding of the Shaiva Siddhanta, a grave would not have been required for a king who essentially had been unfettered from his mortal coils and ascended to become like a Shiva. I think that today the idea of a samadhi is a much bigger part of the Indian cultural and political consciousness. We have, of course, Gandhi Samadhi in Delhi, which remains a very important site to the present. But I think we should be open to the idea that might not have been the case for medieval people, because we know that when, in some cases, for example, Aditya Chola, who was the great grandfather of Rajaraja, he died in battle, and a temple was raised over his ashes. I think it's in the hills near Tiruvannamalai, if I'm not wrong. Unless I mixed up my geography. Maybe it's a bit more north than that. But I don't know if this was necessarily the case for Rajaraja. I think that to his mind, I think he was much more interested in the temple itself as carrying forward his legacy. I think that the scale of the temple, the scale of the lingam, was meant to express, in a sense, his affinity, his kinship with the divine. So, in a sense, that is his funerary monument. In whether his ashes are present there, whether his body is present there, it's impossible for us to say. But we can say fairly confidently that Rajaraja intended that to be the legacy of his life and of his career. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you for the wonderful session. And my question was that there are two narratives, historical narratives. One is by Bertenstein, which deals with segmentary state theory, which is opposing Nilakanta Shastri's centralized state. And another narrative is the plunder politics theory proposed by George Spencer, that the plunder and the lootings of the military campaigns was the main source for building the temples, maybe Brihadishwara temple or Gangaikkonda Cholapuram. That was that. Both of them quote that the Kadamai tax was not paid to the royal court, but it was paid to the Nagarams, the segmentary state, of course. The Nagarams, you quoted Pair Nagarams or Mahan Nagarams, was a huge sect of administrative sect which controlled all the villages, dozens and thousands of villages. So how would you counter this narrative where you say that lord of the land and as well as the sea, when you talk about such a thallocracy kind of empire, how would you counter this narrative?
Can we get a round of applause for this extremely scholarly question? Thank you for this very well-informed question. I think that, at least in my reading of the way that medieval states function, I think the best way to think of them is through Professor Herman Kalke's formulation of the integrative state, where the state is constantly trying through various means to extend its sway, variously defined, over more and more diverse and geographically diffuse actors. And I think it explains definitely the Chola state quite well, because it is not entirely segmentary, because yes, localities are very receptive to Chola charisma. People want to put the king's name and regnal year in front of their inscription, and they're not being coerced to do this, and they're not doing this as part of a ritual polity. They clearly have their own incentives for engaging with the state. on the other hand, it is not entirely a state that is powered by plunder, because it does have a much more sophisticated administration than any other medieval polity. Like, by modern standards, it had 100 revenue officials, to give you a sense of it. But by the standards of a medieval state, that is like twice or thrice more than what courts actually had. So it's not exactly centralized. It's not entirely focused on plunder because it is receiving substantial income. But at the same time, it does have an urge to plunder. It does have an urge to conquer, and that does power to a great extent this wave of temple building that connects it to more and more localities. So obviously, don't worry, there is no essay in the book arguing for why we should think of it as an integrative, not a segmentary state. But if you read the footnotes and if you read the way I have presented the evidence, I do subscribe most substantially to that model. So thank you once again for a great question. Yes, ma'am.
Very, very quick question. I was really impressed that the sheep were more important than cows. I was just wondering whether there was a connection between the sheep during the Chola Empire and the sheep in the Greek era.
The sheep in the?
Greek era, because sheep are very important in the Greek.
I think it's a case of convergent evolution where sheep are fairly hardy animals, fairly easy to herd, quite numerous, and can be used for meat without any religious compunctions about it. So I think that, and because while the floodplain itself is very agriculturally rich, a substantial swathe of Tamil Nadu is actually fairly dry, and in these kinds of terrains, sheep are the easiest animal to be able to raise. So I think that's why we are seeing this interesting parallel on different sides. Thank you.
I would like to congratulate you on your book.
Thank you, my friend.
And I found your book more engaging than Neelkanth Shastri's The Cholas. With all due respect. My question is, was Sangam poetry useful for you in reconstructing the administration and society of the Cholas? Because, say, Sangam poetry, many of them are said to be written by Chola kings themselves. And you emphasize war. And then even in Sangam poetry, mothers are told to be happy when their sons die in war, or they'll kill themselves their son desert battle. And is the Tirukural have anything to do with Chola administration?
I love this audience. So the Sangam period poetry is from well before the period that I'm looking at, but in some ways it is useful. Its description of infantry battles, for example. I think today when we think of a medieval battle, we think of guys like running at each other from across a battlefield. But the reality of medieval warfare was that you had to fight in formations. And you'd be fighting with guys from your village. And you would know that if one of you died, then the rest of you would have to take care of his family. Right? So you have to remember that, like, obviously you have these astonishing inscriptions where men are making gifts in the name of their friends who died in such and such battle, that sort of thing, which you don't see in many other parts of India. So how did these men actually fight? We don't have such detailed descriptions of war from the medieval Cholas, but the way that a spear formation works is pretty much the same anywhere in the world. And in Sangam poetry, you have descriptions of how the young men band together, they advance to the front lines, and then they start teasing their enemies. They start yelling insults at them, then a champion might come and fight a bit, then they'll go back. Then the two spear foremen will come and they'll heave and shove at each other. And very interestingly, in the 1970s, a team of American scholars went to Papua New Guinea and they recorded how the tribes there do battle, because they're using similar technology, using spears, using bows, javelins, and they fight in the same way. They have packs of young men who move forward, shove at each other a little bit, and then a champion will come fight a little bit, and then so on and so forth. So the big casualties in battle happened when the formation was broken. When men are retreating and they can't defend each other, then they can be run down by cavalry, by elephants. So the Sangam literature provides an interesting, it provides much more depth to our understanding. But I think a deeper way in which the Sangam poetry impacted the book was the dedicatory line is from a poem by Kaniyan Ponkundran, the astrologer, and it's the sole poem in the entire corpus of Sangam poetry that does not deal with war or with love. And the story goes that Kaniyan Ponkundran is asked, why don't you eulogize kings? Look at all the other poets are doing, what are you doing? And he says that we are all travelers on the river of life. And we never know when the raft on which we are sitting will be dashed against the rocks by rapids from a great downpour from skies slashed by lightnings. Therefore, we are not amazed by the great, and more importantly, we do not scorn the lowly. And this extraordinary idea, I think, the fact that ancient people thought this way really struck a chord with me. And to an extent, this is why, Chalapathy sir, I took so much time and attention to try and talk about ordinary people, because just as the present is not defined by our political leaders, the past is not just a story of kings. The past is a story of people like you and me who are constantly buffeted by the tides of power and the various ways in which we still find meaning and love and family and continue to survive generation after generation. So that is the most profound way in which poetry affected. Yes, sir.
I loved your presentation and I'm looking forward to the book. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You speak a lot about the importance of raising what the common person thought. I was wondering to what extent today's government museum, which is so rich in Chola art, but so poor in the way the descriptions are put, the way the stuff is presented, why can't there be greater interaction between these amazing museums and what is happening, like your book, and why isn't there an exhibition there? And scholars like yourself putting proper labels below all the beautiful Nataraja sculptures, for example. So this was one.
I think a big part of this, ma'am, is the lack of funding. I think that generally speaking, archaeology and museum departments across the country are chronically starved of funds. They play almost no part in state budgets. They are never an election platform. You never see a politician campaigning on the strength of, hey, I'm going to make this museum a really great display. Unfortunately.
And there's a turf war between historians, archaeologists, and museologists.
Yes.
They belong to different camps.
So the way that I see, actually going back to your earlier question, Chalapathy sir, about the academic historian, the public historian, I think that these kinds of fences that have been drawn around the disciplines end up harming all of us. Not only does society get deprived of what could be tremendously engaging histories, but I think that you need public historians to generate public interest, to impact political ideas, to give politicians an incentive to invest in museums and cultural spaces. And this in turn benefits academic historians because it means more funding for them to continue their work, and ends up benefiting us public historians because then we have new discoveries to bring to the public. So I think that the challenge for India in the next few decades is to create this cycle, this feedback loop. You have some thoughts on this?
It has to be done.
I agree.
No two ways.
Absolutely. So thank you for your question.
That will be the last question.
Oh, no.
You can save all the questions for when he's signing. The books
Yes.
are available outside for sale. He will sit here and sign for all of you. Give him 5 minutes.
Thank you all. Thank you for being so lovely audience. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
What's your next book?
I wish I.
What is your next book?
My only next goal is to survive the Lit Fest circuit.